webinars run by our technology and digital group. We've been running various webinars over the course of the past month or so to lift everyone's spirits before Christmas. And we think we found another topic today that should get everybody interested and excited and ready to break for Christmas. As a brief intro, I'm Lee Crook. I'm a director in our commercial and technology group. And Sally Mewies joins me here, and Sally is a partner and heads up our kind of digital tech and commercial practices. So when thinking about what's been interesting from a tech and digital perspective over the past 12 months, well, as we've all moved to working online, it's never been more in focus, really. And one of the topics that I'm sure we're all dealing with and have had to deal with as part of our businesses or helping our businesses is how to scale up, improve the efficiency of our IT environments, our infrastructure, the services we receive, how to do it quickly, how to do it efficiently, and how to do it safely. And from our perspective, a lot of that focus falls on cloud computing, cloud services, the infrastructure, the applications, the software that can all be provided by the cloud. Now, when thinking about how best to deliver and present on this topic and what to say and to make it interesting and something useful, because we appreciate it can be quite techy, which is what we're here for, but also can be quite difficult to bring to life, and particularly from a business perspective when we're speaking to our internal stakeholders and our business contacts, bringing it to life and helping them understand what are the real risks and what can we really achieve in our contracts when contracting for cloud services. So we thought the best way of delivering this would be to deliver it in a interview style. So I'm going to be the Frost to Sally's Nixon. I think we suggested earlier, hopefully we'll make it marginally more interesting than when Parkinson interviewed Meg Ryan, although as you can tell the similarities are quite striking. So I think what we're going to do today is run through the topics, run through some of the key issues, and just try and focus on when we're looking at cloud, looking at agreements for the provision of cloud services, cloud infrastructure or infrastructure on the cloud, what should we really be focusing on and where we best focusing our time and our energy. So I think to take it right back to the beginning and appreciate some of this, maybe teaching some of the people who are joining us today, like teaching them to suck eggs. But we think it's really important that when talking about the cloud, we really understand what we're talking about and what the cloud is made up of. You know, what are the constituent elements of a cloud environment? How can it be delivered? Is it public? Is it private? How? And then what are the types of service models on offer? So I think to sort of briefly as a starter for 10, Sally, when we're talking about cloud, what are we talking about? What is the cloud environment?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Lee. And I think, because cloud has been around for so long, it's easy to kind of assume that everybody knows what you're talking about. And I think it does mean different things to different people. Absolutely. I'm going to start. It's always good, isn't it, when you start a talk with a picture, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm hoping that everybody can see that. I'm now going to demonstrate my lack of ability when it comes to... Can everybody see that slide okay? Is that can you see it, Lee? Yep. So I think because it is quite complex, I think it's really helpful to look at this diagrammatically. And what we're talking about when we're talking about cloud services is we are talking about a form of outsourcing of IT. I mean, that's fundamentally what this is. You are passing over elements of your IT systems that might traditionally have been in premise in your buildings and under your control to a third party to administer. And that service, and it is really technically a service, that is delivered back to you through some kind of browser, through the internet, whether it's Google or one of the other internet browsers. It's complicated in many ways because there are different types of service. And this diagram actually oversimplifies it to some degree because there's all sorts of different versions and flavours of cloud services that you may encounter. But for the purposes of this talk, I think it's simple just to distill it down into kind of the three main elements. And I've done this as a circle. Sometimes in the past I've kind of done it as a stack as well, because it's a sort of layer. So right at the bottom you've got the data centre. So this is the physical building in which the physical equipment sits that supports this cloud infrastructure. So that's there in that middle centre. The next layer of service is what we call infrastructure as a service. So that might be just access to equipment that sits in that data centre. And above that, sitting on that infrastructure, is what we refer to as platform as a service. And this is typically suppliers would use this to develop application code. So instead of having to set up your own infrastructure on your own servers to write code, you can utilize a platform as a service, which makes the process of developing code for your own individual software applications more efficient in many cases. And then right at the top, we've got software as a service, and this is the thing that most of us will encounter if you're a lawyer or you're a contract manager or advisor in terms of putting in place these contracts. And most of us are dealing with the top layer, software as a service, and that's the delivery of functionality in software, whether it's accounting, customer relationship management, all those different kind of things, delivery of that functionality to your business over the internet, essentially. So those are the different flavours of it. Now, what I think does get a bit more confusing is this kind of private cloud, public cloud side of it. And that's because, and this is where people get confused about, is this multi-tenanted or is it not multi-tenanted? And I have to say, as a tech lawyer who's been doing this for over 20 years, I sometimes find it difficult to understand, because I think there's quite a lot of confusion in businesses in terms of what elements they're actually buying and accessing. But essentially, the public cloud is infrastructure that's open to lots of different people. So you're sharing the environment with other tenants, with other business users. A private cloud is where you're utilizing these services, again, through an internet browser, but it's dedicated to you. So it's kind of your own instance of the cloud infrastructure. And I often think it's quite helpful to think about this. When you're using a public cloud, or when you are using something multi-tenanted, and that's the language that people often use, it's like really being in a building where you rent one room and Lee's next door and other people are all sharing that same building. Whereas when you're in a private arrangement, it's really just you on your own. And I think sometimes you do get a combination of private and public cloud, but we're going to come back to this point over and over again in this session. And Lee knows what I'm going to say now, and he'll probably roll his eyes when I say it. It really is important before you turn the page to the liability clause and start swiping through great swathes of it to amend it. You absolutely have to understand what you're buying here, because you can't manage the risk associated with buying these types of services until you really understand it. And I know that's difficult because everyone's under pressure to get things signed quickly, and I know people get pressure from business, but it's just such a critical point, and I'm going to keep saying it over and over again until Lee helps.
No, I think you're absolutely right there. I think particularly with procuring cloud services, whether we're simply doing storage, or we're developing some piece of software that we're going to use as part of our CRM, or we're using a server that's provided externally. I think understanding how that fits in the full environment of your own IT and thinking of it as an estate, what are those building blocks made up of, is probably the most important piece of advice you can give to your business, your internal stakeholders, to your clients, so they can really see how these relevant pieces of infrastructure fit together and where the agreements come in place, because that's often more valuable than going through the detail of the terms and the warranties to people, where with some of the public providers and the standard packages, there isn't much room for manoeuvre. Advising the business on where it sits, and you can understand where the pressure points are, where the overlap is, that seems a key part of this. I think a related question.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think that you're absolutely right there, because I think there are lots of commercial agreements and lots of things you can buy and advise on without really understanding what they are, and it probably doesn't really matter too much. But it absolutely is not the case with cloud. You do absolutely have to have some understanding of what you're buying.
And I think one of the challenges we often come across when dealing with it as well is because it's anything you can't touch, you can't see it, you can't feel it. It's not on site, it's not on premises, it's not something you download. It's not your standard package-year-old license agreement that you used to get. And so that feels like it's one of the complications that people just struggle from a kind of theoretical level of getting their head around. But in terms of when it comes to documenting these types of arrangements, just why think it is more complicated than your typical license agreement with annual support and maintenance? And what makes these more difficult to prepare, to negotiate, and then why are they more tricky to get your head around?
Yeah, I think it's really challenging, actually. I think in the early days when Salesforce was the only SaaS that anyone had ever heard of, it was kind of simpler in a funny sort of way because I'm going back probably 10 years now, but there wasn't the same issues around data, so there wasn't the same levels of concern around personal data protection and security that there are now. Well, a technical person listening to this will say that's absolute rubbish, because of course there were, but there weren't in the sort of lawyer piece of it, the advisory piece of it. You just weren't looking at that as much, and it was typically used for non-essential business activities around sort of CRM stuff. It was kind of the edges of IT infrastructure within businesses. And it was kind of simple to contract for because it was just plug and play. It was really easy to spin up. You knew that you weren't going to get any movement on the contract terms. It was what it was. But equally, in the early days, the term of these licenses was maybe 1 year and you could just be off again and you could go somewhere else. So there was more, theoretically, and whether in practice there was more portability to move between solutions. What's happened is the whole environment has just got more complex. People are using cloud more for business critical structures. There is more private cloud and versus public cloud. And obviously in a private cloud environment where you're creating an instance that's just for you, potentially can get more in terms of contractual movement. And of course, the whole issue around security, cyber, business continuity, data protection has just gone massively up the agenda in terms of protecting customer data. So I do think it's hard because sometimes you look at something that is a cloud service and just understanding, what it is, how risky is it? Am I going to get any changes from the supplier? What should I be pushing for? All of that piece is quite tricky, and that's hopefully what we're going to talk a bit more about.
Mm. So bearing in mind the reality of the position we're in, if we're buying data storage or we're buying a simple SaaS, we're engaged in a simple SaaS agreement that's provided by the cloud, bearing in mind, I'd say, that limited movement that we think we're going to get when we're not paying and making that big investment, that private cloud solution, the big environment, and we're using what we all think we know cloud to be, which is relatively cheap, low cost, flexible and efficient. What are the real issues should we focus on? What can we get movement on, and what can we get comfortable on when we're advising our business that this is what we at a basic level have to be focusing on?
Yeah, there's obviously context here because, as I say, depending on how high value it is, the levels of configuration that might be being done to the cloud services, if you are using private cloud, will depend obviously on how easy it is to negotiate. But for me, there are 4, I think, really important issues. We should have done a thing where we do a bingo where whoever is right on how many times I say understand what you're buying can get a prize, like a bottle of champagne or something. So
keep a log.
Yeah, you keep a log. And anyone can write in and say how many times did she say that. So there are, for me, 4 issues. Understand what you're buying, that's absolutely critical. Due diligence, again, people say, ooh, but due diligence and tying up the technical due diligence that your internal business is doing, because most people have got kind of a security checklist that's sent out to new suppliers. But I think what tends to happen is that they aren't aligned with what the lawyer bit is doing and the business bit is doing, and that's a bit of a gap for me. Understand where that is, do the due diligence around the security, and we're going to talk a bit more about that. Understand around business continuity, and when I'm talking about business continuity, I'm talking about what does your supplier do if it has an outage? Does it have a second site? Does it fail over? All those kinds of questions. But equally, you'll remember, let me see whether I can now share this again. Yes, I can, hopefully. Can you see my screen? You'll remember what I said about all the different layers, and sometimes what you might have here down at the data center level is the owner of the building, the data center operator might be somebody different, the infrastructure provider might be somebody different, the platform might be provided by Microsoft or somebody, and the software as a service functionality might be provided by somebody else again. So again, understanding that stack and understanding what will happen if one of these disappear, what if they go insolvent, what happens if they fall out with the infrastructure provider. There's not always something you can do about that. So I'm not saying there's necessarily always an answer to it, but understanding that and understanding where the risks are and how you get your data out, that's what I mean by business continuity. I think it's a point. And I think it's a point that isn't necessarily always given enough attention. And obviously you've got the whole security GDPR issue there as well. But my third point, so understand what you're buying, the due diligence bit and really getting under the skin of that. The commercials are so critical around some of this stuff. There's who can use it, can just you use it? I know this sounds really basic, but the times that you see licenses and SaaS agreements that don't cover these points properly, be really clear in the contract. Can you use it, just you as the business user? Can your suppliers use it? Can your service providers use it? Can your group companies use it? Can your customers access it? Those points, sell a business. I mean, we've been talking recently, Lee, about divested entities and the challenge be there about continuity. Be really clear about that. And then guess what my final point is going to be? We should have done a little point on this. Exit. Think about exit first. So treat exit, even though these agreements are really, really short, typically, so if you look at an Oracle or a Salesforce one even, they're typically really short. Exit is often poorly dealt with. And you got to treat exit like a major outsourcing. You're going to need help. I think we're going to talk a bit more about that, so I won't go on at the moment. But exit is so critical, I think.
And going back to that point you made about advising on the commercials and talking about the commercials, and sort of linking into why this has become more complicated than your typical license with support agreements, I think is what one area which we do add value, and we can add value to our contacts, our internal in-house counsel support on that, is when advising them on what the commercial, how the metrics work in these types of arrangements. So, it's relatively straightforward in some license arrangements, aside from your big ERP system, where you are, it's authorized users, then you've got your limits on that. Whereas in the cloud, it's talking, it's more about the amount of network used, and the amount of capacity you're using, the amount of data you're storing, and that can massively increase the cost over time. So it's a flexible service, and so the price you see is continuing on your current use, but it will scale up as you scale up as well, and it's making sure that the business really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And linking into that is, again, primarily most times at dealing with this, it's talking about data storage off-site, and that's something we get challenged with quite a lot, which is how do we ensure, what can we get on security? This is often critical data served on external servers on the internet rather than something that's downloaded on a file on a local device. There's that kind of theoretical challenge of people getting their head around, like, this isn't on site anymore, it's somewhere else. How secure is it? And, the Azures of this world will tell you it's actually much more secure. They're in the business of doing this. But when dealing with them, negotiating with them, and particularly in certain sectors, the financial services sector, just what can we seek to achieve in terms of commitments on security?
Yeah. I think, again, security is a big issue, isn't it? And it should be covered in the contracts. In most cases, it is these days. Again, going back in time, as I'm able to because I'm so old, it used to be, but it clearly is covered, and it absolutely should be. I think it's a really difficult one again because you hear people say, it's Microsoft, it's Amazon Web Services, I don't need to be worried about that. Of course, Google had an outage yesterday. I think it affected quite a big chunk of, I think it was a worldwide outage. there was a famous Amazon Web Services outage back in 2017, which I think was just not, it wasn't actually a cyber attack. I think it was just someone not flicking the right switch in a data center. And so these things do happen, and they do happen to the big providers. So again, it's really important to understand what the security commitments are of the provider. And I think it's really important, I know we've got some suppliers on the call, so I think it's really important for the suppliers to be clear too, because I think what people often think about cloud is that it's all over to the provider, it's entirely down to the provider, but this is not cloud security necessarily, it's IT security, and it's a partnership between the customer and the supplier, and they're working together to create secure environments. It's not the case always that it's just down to the supplier, and particularly, when you are at the, I'm just going to hopefully show this slide again. No, I'm not. Oh, there we are. When you're down at the sort of data center IaaS level, then the security obligations are really more with the customer other than physical security. As you go higher up the stack through platform and software, then obviously the security commitments go more towards the supplier because they're in control of the functionality. But there are still lots of issues for buyers and customers about password access. The example of Amazon was human error. It was someone doing the wrong thing, not changing their password every night, not having encrypted data in certain parts of their business, not having two-factor authentication, all those kind of things. So it's a partnership, and the contract needs to reflect that. And, security, business continuity and service levels around outages all kind of work together, I think, for me. And understanding that and understanding what the obligations are of both sides in relation to security is really important. It was important, it's always been important, even before the changes in data protection legislation. But of course, with what's been happening with GDPR and very recently what's been happening with transfers of data to the United States, the Schrems II decision about how challenging it can be now to lawfully have data access outside of Europe, you have to look at this more carefully. You cannot now avoid this in the context of cloud services if there is access even just for support services outside of Europe. That's a big, big issue now. And it's important to be able to understand the security around the cloud and to have documented that effectively.
And then it can be it's incredibly technical world to get your head around and requires a lot of input of the relevant standards and minimum standards you would want a provider, a supplier to meet. And I guess it's a challenge being from somebody, we just don't have that in-house expertise, don't have that level of sophistication in our business to rely on. So can we give any kind of suggestions as to minimum standards, minimum accreditations, or point people in the right direction as to where we should be looking when setting those standards?
Yeah, we'll send a list. We can send a list out after the call of the kind of common standards that you might see that suppliers sign up to. This is not really a legal issue. It's obviously a technical issue, and I'm sure there are lots of people watching this who know more about this than I do. But if you are, this is hard, I think, for the small businesses because as you say, large businesses, law firms, they have technical teams who understand all of this. But if you're a small business, then obviously it's quite difficult. But I've always feel some comfort if there's a set of security policies. I know it sounds daft, but if someone's bothered to go to the trouble of actually documenting, a clear set of security policies, you take some comfort from that. If they've got ISO 27001 accreditation, then that's an information security management standard. That's helpful. There are cloud standards, ISO cloud standards, I think it's 27017 and 18, which are specifically focused on cloud. So again, if somebody's been, if a business has been accredited to those sorts of standards. And then there's obviously the US SOC style reporting, which is a much more extensive standard that sometimes suppliers will deliver. But the other thing to remember is that most cloud providers, certainly at the infrastructure level and the platform level, will be required under English law to comply with the Network and Information Systems Regulations. This was the old Cyber Security Directive, which mainly applies to the provider of essential services, but also does cover cloud services within certain parameters. It doesn't apply, I think, to suppliers who are below 50 people or have a lower turnover. But so you've always got, or you should in most cases, have the comfort of knowing that these businesses have by law to comply with those NIS regulations, and they impose security standards that are not exactly the same, and obviously it goes beyond personal data, but quite similar to those in GDPR. So again, I know I've banged on about this, but I just think security is going to become even more important, actually. And this whole thing about understanding what you have got and what you're dealing with is not going to be an excuse that it's just too difficult to get your brain around.
I think on the standards and the minimum standards, but I think it would be a good idea to share that around.
No, we can do that. Yeah, we will send that out afterwards, and these are ones that we see quite often in contracts. Yeah.
And for my own sanity, I'm going to pretend that you didn't just recall those off the top of your head. I'm sure you did. So you mentioned on security then, and I think when we are talking about security, you mentioned it, particularly on Schrems too, and what the biggest challenge we see is the real nervousness around customer data, or the types of customer data we've got. So obviously, I just think main issue that people focus on is what do we get at the end? How do we get it back? What's their obligation to return it? How long do we have to keep it before it's destroyed? Those kind of issues. But there is more to that. What about during the life cycle of this arrangement? What should we be looking for in terms of the cloud provider and their obligations in respect of our data that they're handling, be it backups or whatever means your measures you expect them to take to ensure that we get comfort that we get what we want out of the arrangement, they look after it, but also from a compliance point of view to make sure that if the ICO come calling, we can show properly documented agreements in place where we've put measures to say that this is how we protect customer data.
Yeah. So customer data, again, big point, and it's a big point for a number of reasons. I mean, there's just more data. There's just a lot more data now, and it's data that's inputted into a service, but then it's obviously data that might be observed or derived or created as part of the service. And as we have more sophisticated technology, this is becoming ever growing. We all know that. In the original SaaS contracts, I think people never probably even mentioned customer data. It's kind of just implied that it belonged to the customer and that was the end of it. Well, it wasn't necessarily a big point. And then we moved to a place where you'd see a lot of clauses that said all the intellectual property rights in the customer data belong to the customer. That doesn't really mean anything. It's not really helpful. What I think it is about now is control and use of that customer data in the system. And there simply is no excuse now or no other way of doing this other than writing carefully in the contract what the customer is, what the supplier, I guess, essentially can do with it and what the customer can do with it. And typically, because of the growth in sort of artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies, suppliers are keen to benefit from know-how and knowledge that they receive from their systems processing and activate, working on customer data. And there's it's right, there's a tension there actually, because the customer doesn't want to give away valuable crown jewel confidential information or anything that might be of value to their business or how they operate the business. But equally, a supplier might be quite keen to have access to some of that data on an aggregated basis because it's either useful to sell on as a market research tool or it's just useful to improve their products. So that just becomes a bit of a horse trade, I think, around, what can both parties get comfortable and obviously document that carefully in the contract is the advice there. The other issue, of course, for buyers is this issue of portability and interoperability, i.e., I'm using this cloud service. It's not a perpetual right to use this service forever. It may come to an end. I don't want to be locked in to a particular solution or a vendor, and therefore I need a commitment around getting that data out, being able to migrate that data, being able to take the service somewhere else. And I think we're going to talk about that in Brexit, aren't we?
I think one of the, again, another challenge, what sounds like we constantly challenge our clients in our internal business contacts, and maybe if you speak to some of them, I imagine they say we do. But one challenge I do like to make is when we're talking about data is make sure we really want it. What is the data in the service? What data are they holding, and how do we want to receive it, and is there value in it? Because people can get really hung up on what the data is here and what use you can make of it in this obsession that through use of big data we get greater insights. Well, yeah, if that is true, but depending on what the service is, sometimes it just isn't that interesting. So you just need to challenge them on that, and again that see if it truly is something that we really need to be pushing for. And if it is, and particularly if there's personal data involved in this, it's making sure that you're properly documenting responsibilities, and then from the commercial point of view, it's what do we want, how do we extract it, and in what format do we want it. And that leads on to kind of the other point, which is whether it's a cloud services or just talking about historical IT outsourcing agreements, where we're talking about exit. And we're talking, and you often get this is when you're documenting the agreement, you've been negotiating it for a while, because it's a very valuable agreement, and then you say to the client, obviously we need to think about exit in this 5-year material outsourcing agreement. What do you want to do on exit? And they say, well, it's not something we want to get to at the outset. It just seems like we're all good here. We want to go into this in the right spirit. Well, I think like you said, you have to think of it as another service tower. It's something that and we can talk about this whether you think it's right. I think it's very difficult to say at the outset what the full exit plan will be. Having nothing in there and having this within 6 months, we'll use our reasonable endeavours in good faith to discuss what the exit plan will be. How many times does that really happen? You at least want the framework of what's the minimum requirements and who's going to pay for it. And I think from my experience, that's often been a challenge that I've had to raise to our own clients is, we want you to pay for this. Do you think that's fair from your experience as well as saying?
Yeah, I mean, again, I've always been strong on this, actually. I think that customers should pay for exit services, because I think that they are like as you said, like you should treat it like another service tower. It's so critical. And, it's like the old adage, isn't it? You get what you pay for. And sometimes customers and buyers try to get things for free on exit, particularly where agreement might have ended for a material breach. But my view, and it's not a legal view, obviously, but it's not a legal point, but my view is that that's false economy. You need a supplier to be motivated to help you exit. You should pay them properly for that. And it's the only way to get a really good service. And getting that data out in whatever format you need it or anything, is going to be critical in order to move to a new supplier. I mean, there is the data point, but there also is the point, do you need assistance like you might do in and out? I've said already that this is like an IT outsourcing in many ways. Do you need other assistance to migrate to a new provider? The other point that I think you see in big outsourcing contracts, but you sometimes don't see in cloud agreements, is if the agreement terminated suddenly for a breach, for example, you might transition period where you can continue to use
I think that is true.
In order to be able to transition to a new provider, and that's not often built into agreements. It's kind of skirted over, and that is not always important, but I think it is a consideration that you need to think about.
And on that, you'll also see in thinking about, it's difficult at the outset to agree what you want, but certainly formats of data, also that getting sure you've got the right access rights for not just you, but third parties who are going to come in, who need to use it, who maybe need to do an element of auditing, of due diligence before they take the service on. It's getting them the rights to do that. and not ending up in a difficult negotiation at the end of your service term where you're going to have to pay something to get it right. You've been paying for a period of time and you just want to move it, and it is it can skew the amount of you pay for the deal and the deal value and the efficiency of it if you have got a really poorly exited material kind of outsourcing, whether that's cloud services or otherwise. If you haven't dealt with that properly, it can make your cost of your exit or your new arrangement really expensive.
Yeah, no, agree with that.
And another point where I'm trying to, just what can we seek to achieve and what should we be really focusing on this is when we're asked to provide our risk review reports on cloud services agreement or your standard SaaS agreement, clients or business contacts will say to us, I want to review the IP provisions, I want to know what warranties and performance I'm getting, and I really need to know that, the limitation of liability and the exclusions of liability. Have we got any kind of key or messages or focus areas of, just what is achievable here and the reality of what they're going to be looking at?
I mean, it's funny, isn't it? We've probably talked for 35 minutes now about what the key issues are in cloud services, and we haven't talked about service levels, warranties, liability, IP, and I think that sort of tells a story, doesn't it, in terms of, in this world, what are the key points? I mean, IP is an interesting area, and sometimes we get asked questions about, well, do I need a software license to use SaaS? And I guess the answer to that is it depends. I don't think you do for SaaS where there is no download of software onto local machines or laptops or servers or anything like that, technically, and I think that's an accepted view, that you don't formally need a license. You do still see sometimes that license language in the IP clause around a license to use the SaaS. I don't think it matters overly, if I'm really honest. I don't think it's a big point. The bigger point is to be really clear about what you can and can't do and who can access it and who can't access it, etc. Sometimes you see, and again, maybe this is more in the private cloud world, ability to do statements of work with maybe some additional deliverables and configurations round the SaaS, for the want of a better expression. And I think in relation to that, understanding the basis on which that is provided from the buyer to the customer and whether that's a license arrangement, is it perpetual, is it a term, that's quite important to get right. Owning IP in this world is going to be really unusual. It's going to be pretty much never, I would say, if I'm honest. I don't necessarily think nowadays that, we do get clients, as you know, Lee, who get very concerned that if they've paid for some software development, there's this kind of mantra, I've paid for the software development and so therefore I should own it. I don't agree with that, if I'm really honest. I think that in most cases, as long as you've got a right to use it, it's not going to make any difference whether you own it. And in some cases, it can be a bad thing to own something, because if you own it, the supplier doesn't own it, the supplier isn't going to update it, upgrade it and incorporate it into their roadmap, and you're going to end up with potentially some technical debt. So I would say, unless this thing is really incredibly unique and it's giving you some major business advantage, trying to own created IP in the cloud environment is not a fight that you'll win, hey? And it probably isn't a fight you should be having anyway. The key thing really around this is to understand what it is that you're using and what you can access. Now, what we are seeing actually more of, and this is kind of a supplier point actually, is that there's a lot more granularity now in some clauses around IP, because what suppliers are wanting to do is protect algorithms, automation rules, libraries, all of that kind of AI, machine learning stuff. And they want to be really clear that where they're providing a service, the customer doesn't have any rights or access around that. So, and I think this is tied into the point we were talking about, where an algorithm creates data, who has the rights over all of that. I think we're going to see an increase in complexity around some of these intellectual property clauses, not because the customer's owning the IP, but just because it gets more complicated as we get into the AI and machine learning stuff. So that's where I am kind of on IP. On service levels, warranties and liability, again, in most cases, and it depends on your negotiating power, it depends if it's a private cloud or a public cloud, you're not going to get a huge amount of movement on any of that. So if you remember, I said the public cloud is like a big building where you're sharing it with lots of people, but you've all got the same carpet or you've all got the same wallpaper on the walls. And in that kind of a world, you can't have different wallpaper from the person next door because it kind of doesn't work. So you're all going with the flow. It's clearly different in a private cloud, potentially. And therefore trying to claim different service levels or mend the service levels for Oracle, forget it. It's not going to wash. It's not practical. It isn't going to work. And again, on the warranty side and the liability side, they do exclude liability. The suppliers are not going to take responsibility for operational damage that's done to your business in using these systems. And that's because they don't understand the extent of that loss. They're not working in your world. And they're just not prepared to take that risk. So trying to get them to accept any kind of loss of profit, loss of revenue, whether they're direct or indirect, is not going to fly. And to be honest, I don't even bother asking. What I think you have to be careful about in the liability clause is loss of corruption or use of data. I always strike that out because that cuts across your security, it cuts across your data protection, it cuts across backup operations. So I typically don't accept that as an exclusion. But, again, you do see that in some contracts. So I think, you need to look at the areas around service levels, warranties and liabilities, and you clearly need to make sure there's nothing in there that's cutting across some of the fundamental stuff. But it's quite hard to get many changes. And to be honest with you, if the service is a little bit worse than you might have expected, showing loss flowing from that when you're in a service contract is very difficult for a customer. And therefore, you just need to kind of accept that as a principle. But where it does take me to is a point that, being tight, because it's quite difficult to get real life meaningful commitments around service levels that you understand and control. And because it's quite difficult to get much on warranties and liability, being tied into these agreements for long periods of time, which is becoming more and more typical. I think I said at the outset, the original agreements were about a year long. Now you see them 5 years and more. And that's in part because the systems are complicated and people are costing more. You do need to build in an exit route if you're just generally not happy, but it's not going to amount to anything that looks like a material breach. So I think there are a number of issues flowing through all that.
And when looking at the warranties and the liability and what they possibly can get, one thing that does get overlooked is the fact that within all of this as well, there are so many customer dependencies which will remove or limit their liability in any way because of the nature and the way in which the service is being provided and being delivered. Let's make sure that when we're looking at these, we're really focusing on what are our customer dependencies, what are the technical requirements that need this service to be delivered anyway, and focus on getting those right and those clearly documented. If it's not in your control, how do we do it? I think that's the focus. And the amount of times I think we've done this ourselves recently, really honing in on loss of corruption of data and just how valuable that is to make sure that is struck out as an exclusion is really, really important. And that's something that will be, it is something that is easier to measure, the value of that and what it costs you, not just to reconstitute the loss of that data. It's a really important exercise, and that's where we would be focusing in on the liability. As you say, it's different in a private cloud environment, although the amount of deals that clients will do in the lifetime of their business cycle for a private cloud environment, they're not going to be every year. It's by the nature of it's a big investment, but that's where you can get more movement, and particularly, again, maybe not focusing on liability, but on service levels. How are you going to rectify these issues here?
Yeah.
I think that's kind of where I've seen and where I think we try to focus on when trying to give clients the kind of a real life reality of advice of, look, this is where you're going to get to. I think, and that's really, that's one of the messages from today is we in all of this, there's an element of let's kind of be honest with ourselves about what is achievable, bearing in mind who the providers are, the types of cloud services we're going to buy, what's possible with them, bearing in mind it isn't a certain service. There are often security issues that nobody can overcome and give absolute commitments to. It's more about standards and policies that they agree to adhere to, so you've got something objective for them to meet.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I mean, I think, I remember arguing probably 12 years ago for hours with Salesforce about what available meant, so you might be worried about you've only got 99.9% availability, but actually pinning down what available means in these agreements is very challenging, It's not an easy one to crack.
No, and I think one thing, an area which sort of related to the liability piece that I've struggled with recently and trying to navigate and get your head around is use of escrow services when negotiating for cloud, explaining to the clients just how this is going to be set up, because it's very different to how they will typically use it and understand it, so when they're asked and it's seen as part of range, just how is it used, what is it used for?
Yeah. So escrow, just to remind people, was quite popular. I mean, going back many years, for on-premise software where you had the object code copy of the software in your possession. So you just had the runtime object code, but you didn't have the source code. And the source code is obviously the piece of equipment that generally allows you to make changes, fix bugs, that kind of thing. So if your supplier was no longer in existence, you get a release or a copy of this source code. You already had your object code version, so it would enable you to get another provider to update it, maintain it, and all that kind of stuff. And it was, as I say, pretty common in most software licenses 10 or 12, 15 years ago. I think it recently, actually, even before SaaS, you were seeing less people bothering with escrow, because I think in part because the systems are so much more sophisticated that they realised that even if they got the source code, they got the object code version, there probably wasn't going to be a lot they could do anyway, and it would be quite difficult to find proper support people who really understood the products, etc. So there's been a sense that it's probably not worth bother. It's not being so important in the on-premise world. Obviously, when you transfer that, and we talked, didn't we, about business continuity and being really important to understand where the risk might be if you're in a chain or you're in a stack and you're buying a service at one level, what happens if something goes wrong with the providers below? We talked about how important that was to manage, and there are solutions. NCC, who are a big escrow provider, have got products, other people have got products that try to support that business continuity in the event that something goes wrong with the service because one of the key components is no longer available. My experience, I mean, again, I'm not seeing a lot of people using these services. They probably are in really business critical ones. They seem to come in kind of different flavours. One might be around having access to passwords and logins and credentials so that if something goes wrong with your supply, you can still get into your system and get your data out. I've seen sort of data escrow style arrangements where they take a cut of the data every week or month and it's stored off-site. So again, if you can't get access to the service, you've got a copy of data which is reasonably up to date. And then other services where the escrow agent sort of spins up, a replica cloud environment. But whenever I've looked at that, it's been really, really expensive. So, and you also get to a point, well, if I'm going to pay someone to spin up a replica environment, I might as well buy it to begin with. So it becomes so I think it's difficult. I mean, whether the escrow world and maybe I'm slightly behind the pace and maybe there's been some developments on this recently, but I still think it's quite difficult. I don't know that escrow absolutely solves the business continuity issue that we talked about. But and you can see the challenges, because even if you just got a copy of the software element of your SaaS, you'd have to have a very deep understanding of the infrastructure and the platform on which that was sitting to be able to replicate the environment, to be able to continue to use it. And so maybe I guess what people plan for is just to move to another provider in the event, rather than trying to sort of use source code to move on and use it yourself. Maybe you just have to exit and go into a different environment. It's still, I think, one of the big risks.
One, and I appreciate we've been talking for some time about on this, but I just wanted to kind of pick up one of the questions that we had in. Thank you very much for submitting them. And was about the platform. So in terms of the growth of these areas and where we see the main sort of where cloud will become an even more integral part of our life, I think historically it's been in SaaS, but as businesses, including an engineering business here, grows and develops, I think we'll be talking more about platforms being provided as a service in order to develop the AI in these businesses. Is that the next step? Is that, well, it's not next step, it's already happening, but is that the next kind of critical growth area for cloud? Using platforms providers
to
develop those AI products.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, platform as a service obviously is used more by suppliers generally than by customers, because the suppliers are the companies that are actually developing the products. And I think it's, for me, I mean, I've encountered a few platform agreements over the last few months, actually, funnily enough. And I think it's really about drilling down and carefully understanding how the platform works. And lock-in really is a big thing, because if you develop a product on a platform, how portable is that product? And can you take it into a different environment? Can you take it into a different infrastructure? Will it still work? That whole interoperability and portability. We talked about at the top of the stack, we talked about portability and interoperability for the data that's sitting in the SaaS. But for the platform level, it's about, how easy is it to take those products and put them onto a different platform. So if you develop them in AWS, can you take them to Azure, for example? Yeah. It's that kind of thing. But all the issues that we've talked about, I think, are still relevant. That obviously IP, and I've said, didn't I did say you never need to own the IP. Clearly, if you're using a tool to develop your own IP project, then you need to be able to own that. Yeah. Obviously. Yeah,
but that's a very different sort of scenario, typical instance of taking cloud as a service. I think
the whole platform, I mean, what is interesting on platforms is there's obviously a lot of competition attention going on with the big platform providers at the moment. There's cases going on in America now. There's a concern that they're getting very dominant. And as a result of the Schrems II decision, the data protection decision, that there was a big movement in Europe to create their own kind of data infrastructure platform so that data can be stored here and dealt with here without anybody around the world being able to access it. So I think in terms of platforms generally, we're going to see quite a lot of change over the next 12 months. Feels to me quite a lot of developments legally around that, and are they going to be regulated more, and are they going to be forced to share data in a different way, and all that kind of thing. I think it's been quite interesting.
Yeah, and one of the challenges we've had over the past few months is giving clients advice on just what steps should we take right now, particularly with the uncertainty on the Schrems II decision leading up to recently. It's what steps, and I think it is a really difficult position for them to be in, to know what to do now. And what steps to make, whether to make that investment, and whether if something just isn't going to be necessary. So that's a real challenge for clients at the moment. I think that feels like something I've said constantly throughout the past hour. But no, I think that it's from my benefit. It's from my perspective that's been very helpful. It's certainly been much easier as the interviewer than the interviewee. So you've got me for next time. I think it's useful just to summarise my key points and take away from my understandings from this. I think whether we're talking about what we can do now or whether we're talking about what we can do in the future when looking at these, there seems to be kind of a few key issues. I think that the first one is when we're trying to be realistic about what we achieve, looking at what security commitments we've got and what security standards we've got and focusing on those. I think, and that comes in at both at the contractual stage and the due diligence phase. And the second part of it seems like a basic one, but it's really understanding the environment of what you're buying and how, that point we make, that interoperability, easy one for me to say, is how does it fit in with the rest of your environment, both from putting it in, continuing to operate it, do they fix, are they compatible, what configuration do you need, but then also taking it out. And then on the last, which leads to the last point, which is exit. I think we both agree on this. Exit is a service. Exit is a part of the services. Treat it like your old outsourcing, whether it's a back office function or whatever. Pay for that service and document what you want to the extent you can at the outset. And particularly if there's if it's going to be a big data exercise, tell them the format you're going to want that in. Pay for them to do it, because it will be bloody expensive at the end if you don't.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely right.
So they were my lessons for the day, Sally, and I'll be sure to take them away, and I'm sure you'll grill me on them later. I think there's a couple of things we'll follow up on. We'll send around some of those security standards and points for people to look out for, as some of us don't have them off the top of our head. And then any other questions that we've not managed to get through, we can certainly circulate and provide answers to the wider group, and I think that'll be helpful for everyone. So from me, that's kind of it. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining. Bye.